Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Harmony. I work for the City of Portland and BPS. We will get started here in just a few minutes. As we're waiting for people to join us, go ahead and do a brief introduction in the chat of just your names, your pronouns, if you're with an organization, and as a little icebreaker, your favorite holiday film to watch. Just a quick reminder that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. So I just want everybody to be in the know. A little thing should have popped up when you came in. All right, I see people still trickling in. Again, my name is Harmony. I use she, her pronouns. I work for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. We will get started here shortly in just a couple minutes as people get logged into the meeting. If you're just joining us, please feel free to drop your name, any organization you're with, your pronouns, and your favorite holiday movie into the chat.
Vin, you and I typed elf at the same time.
It's playing in the OmniMax Theater this year, this Friday and Saturday.
Cool. Who's going to write a Christmas story?
Or Love Actually.
All right, I see all the entries getting put in here. A couple of housekeeping items as we get going. We love questions. So as we go throughout the evening, at any point in time, if you have a question or a thought that comes into your mind, please feel free to drop that question into the chat. We have several staff members here that in just a little bit will introduce themselves that are able to answer questions that are there. We also have built-in Q&A throughout the evening. So if you're more comfortable or it's easier to just voice your question, go ahead and wait until that Q&A time and we'll prompt you, and you can raise your hand, which is at the bottom of your screen. There's a little key where you can raise your hand and I will call on you when we're ready, and at that point you can unmute to ask your question. But again, if you are comfortable, go ahead and drop anything in the chat and we have people monitoring that to be able to answer right away.
All right. Well, we said we would start at 6:35, right? So I think we're going to get going. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for making the time to be here tonight. My name is Andrea Jacob. I am the Climate Policy and Program Manager here at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm here with my team, and we're going to go around and quickly just introduce ourselves so you know who we are throughout the evening.
Thanks. My name's Ingrid Fish. I work on transportation decarbonization policy here on the climate team at Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pam Neild. I use she, her pronouns. I also work on transportation decarbonization. It's nice to see you.
Everyone, my name is Paul Hawkins. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Buildings and Energy Program Manager, so really focused on the way that the city uses energy. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sonrisa Cooper. I use she, her pronouns. I am Sustainable Economy and Just Transition Analyst, so I work primarily on clean industry, economic development, and climate justice.
Good evening. I'm Janet Hammer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm working on the Clean Industry Initiative.
I'm Kyle Giesner. I'm a policy analyst at BPS.
I'm Sean Wood. I work on deconstruction policy and construction and demolition debris, recycling and reuse.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vin Mason. I use he, him pronouns, and I work on climate and health standards for existing buildings.
Hey everybody, my name is Dirk Clarkson. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the buildings program coordinator and I manage the home energy score program.
Hey everyone, my name is Wayne Grabowski, he, him. I support across the Bureau with community engagement initiatives, and I am the host of the Zoom event itself today. If anyone has tech issues, please direct message me and I can help you figure things out.
Right. Thanks all so much. So this is the first time that we have done this, anything like this. This is intended to be the first in an ongoing series. If tonight goes well, we expect to do about 3 of these throughout the year. Before we start, I want to do a little bit of expectation setting about what to expect. I want to acknowledge, obviously, climate is a vast, complicated, intersectional topic. And I don't think that we'll be able to get through or to get to everything that everybody in this room cares about or wants to talk about. So that's why I want to note that we intend to do more of these, and hopefully we'll learn some things tonight that will tee up future conversations. We're going to do our best to provide you with some information, open things up to questions, hopefully have some dialogue, and we hope it's going to be fun and engaging for you. But we are going to try to keep it within some boundaries just to make it simple for tonight, because we can't talk about literally everything. So we are going to start with our climate emergency work plan. Kyle and I are going to go over what that work plan is and our analysis, our decarbonization analysis that is underpinning it. And then we're going to take a poll of these. We've given you 6 topics to choose from, and we'll do a little description of them. And then we're going to do a live poll, and whatever the top 3 are, we're going to dive into those in a little more depth. And then we'll have some Q&A after each of those. And then hopefully we'll have a little time for general discussion depending on how it goes. So we hopefully will wrap up by 8 o'clock. That's our plan. All right. So actually, I'm the first one up. So let's just go to the next slide. Thanks, Sean. So our climate emergency work plan and pathways analysis. Next slide. This past summer, City Council adopted the Climate Emergency Work Plan as the city's climate action plan for the next 3 years. And we're going to go into some depth about what this plan is and what's in it. But before that, I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about history and process. I think it's important to look back a little bit just to recap how we got here to this moment. So Portland, under this Bureau's leadership, has been doing climate action plans since 1993. We were the first city in the United States to adopt a local plan to cut carbon emissions. The last one was adopted by City Council in 2015, and it was really groundbreaking and globally recognized at that time, specifically because it was the first climate action plan to really incorporate a racial equity lens into it. Since that time, we've really been working towards a more collaborative and co-creative model that centers environmental justice communities and really shifts power to the people that are most affected by climate change and who benefited the least from our climate investments and actions. So that's been an ongoing iterative and learning journey together. In 2019, BPS spent considerable time with community and bureaus and other stakeholders to craft a climate emergency declaration, and council adopted that in 2020. And this really established our framework for climate justice as our North Star for how we do all of our climate work. It calls for us to work in different ways with community members to allow for community-driven solutions to come to the front, rather than to do the sort of more traditional government-dominated traditional planning processes. And so we're still working on that. We've been working side by side with community and longstanding partners like Multnomah County to develop those new spaces and relationships. But we still found ourselves in need of having a current climate action plan. The Climate Emergency Declaration is a wonderful aspirational statement, but it is not an implementation plan. And we really found a need to ground ourselves in some real situation, what's really happening on the ground. 2, it's really a core expectation of you all, of the public, that the city have a functioning current climate action plan. And it's a core expectation of the global community that we're part of and the global commitments that we've made to do our part to reduce carbon emissions. So we got to work in January of 2022, so just about a year ago, at BPS in collaboration with over 40 staff across 10 bureaus and offices to develop the Climate Emergency Work Plan, which City Council adopted in August of this past August. Next slide. So we intentionally chose City Council as our main audience for this. And we know that solving climate change is not solely up to City Hall. We need all levels of government, all sectors of society. But we wanted to take this moment to really put a fine point on what City Council's specific responsibility and authority and jurisdiction were. What can they actually do? What are the levers that they have? We wanted to convey, really, with this Climate Emergency Work Plan needed to convey two things: urgency, but also agency. But this slide speaks to the urgency. The IPCC came out with its most alarming report to date while we were in the middle of putting this together. And as we know, the impacts of climate change are already here, and they are already affecting the most vulnerable members of our community: our elders, our houseless, Black and Indigenous people of color, and people experiencing low income. I don't think I have to convince anyone who has lived through the wildfires of 2020 or the heat dome of 2021 that climate change is here in Portland already. So when I first started working on climate issues a long time ago, we really talked mostly about decarbonization and reducing carbon. I mean, resilience and adaptation were in the mix, to be sure, but they were pretty much secondary. And that has changed just in the span of my career. And right now, we cannot afford to just talk about decarbonization anymore. The urgency of resilience, we have to focus on and invest in it with the same urgency. And unfortunately, lack of action around the globe and federally has really brought us to this place, which is that we can't get to be a resilient society and community without deep carbon reductions. So these are closely interlinked and connected, and that's why the Climate Emergency Work Plan addresses both decarbonization and resilience. Next slide, please. So speaking of deep emissions reductions, this graphic from the work plan shows what our two carbon reduction goals are. We have a nearer term goal of a 50% reduction by 2030. And that's just about 7 years from now. It was 8 years when I started doing this presentation, and now it's 7 years. So time is really ticking. And then our ultimate end goal is net zero carbon by 2050. And Kyle's going to do a little explaining about what net zero means. But basically, we need to get all of the carbon gone and then some by 2050 to avert the most harmful effects of the planet warming emissions. So what this also shows is the progress that we've made to date on reducing carbon emissions here in Portland. And while we've made some progress, what you can see is that it's not nearly enough to meet that trajectory. We've really plateaued over the last 10 years instead of the drastic decline that we need. And the science has been pretty clear that our window is closing. Next slide, please. But you don't want to hit people with too much bad news that makes them feel powerless, and it makes them feel like there's nothing that they can do. And so when I mentioned agency, this is the other side of the message. Things are bad. We don't want to understate it. In fact, I don't know if we can overstate it, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be the worst case scenario here. We have pathways, we have solutions, we have this work plan that tells council in some kind of sequence, here's the things you need to do, we need to consider doing within the next 3 years. That puts us on this pathway to get to that 50% in the next 7 years, then ultimately on the pathway to net zero. So we wanted to give them a sense that there is something that they can do. And this is their prescription, if you will, for doing what it takes to reduce the carbon, but also prepare our communities for the impacts that are already here. And I just want to note that the great part about decarbonization and climate work is that it doesn't only, avert climate disaster, but it also brings numerous co-benefits to our communities in the form of new business and workforce opportunities, less congestion, cleaner air, more plentiful and accessible transportation options, and safer and more comfortable and more resilient and affordable homes and buildings. Next slide. So as I mentioned, The priority actions in the work plan are in these two basic buckets, decarbonization and resilience. And I encourage you to go to our website. The plan is available there, along with a lot of other supporting information. On the decarbonization side, which is really where we're going to focus tonight, you can see that this is really the sort of purview of our bureau, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and also the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So the climate, even though I'm the only one sort of right now talking from BPS about the climate emergency work plan, I want to underscore that this is a city-wide plan. It's not just BPS's, it is the whole city. Lots of us have responsibility for this. We are going to talk about the stuff that's really in the BPS wheelhouse later on in our presentations, but they roughly correlate to the areas where the carbon comes from. That makes a lot of sense. On the resilience side, you can see that there's a lot more bureaus involved, and that the activities are really categorized like according to risk, whether that's flooding or wildfire, or some of the investments in solutions like tree canopy and natural resource protection and resilience hubs. So our presentations later will give us an opportunity to dive into some of these decarbonization areas. But for right now, I'm going to pause and turn it over to Kyle to talk a little bit about the analysis.
Right. Thank you, Andrea. So in 2020, as we were passing the climate emergency declaration, we hired a consultant to build a decarbonization pathways model so we could understand what it would take to achieve the targets we are adopting. Next slide. The purpose of this tool is really to help stakeholders visualize the scale of climate action required to meet the targets in the climate emergency declaration. And it's really about looking at the combinations of specific climate strategies that need to stack up to get us to those goals, particularly net zero by 2050. Next slide. The tool is really a visualizer, and it relies on 4 underlying resources where the actual modeling occurs. So first we have our greenhouse gas inventory for Multnomah County. We have a model from the Portland Bureau of Transportation called Vision Eval that looks at the transportation sector emissions and various reduction strategies. We have BPS's Building Analysis and Projections tool that looks at building energy use, property by property across the city, and looks at various strategies there. And then we also used a tool from the US Forest Service to look at the sequestration potential within Multnomah County. These underlying models look at emission reduction potential, and they're fed into the visualizer to show them in context of our overall emissions over time. The tool is limited in a variety of ways, including by the scenarios or strategies that are modeled in those underlying resources. While these underlying models estimate emission reductions from various strategies, they are not prescriptive in precisely which actions are taken when and how those actions will be combined. Pathways allows users to vary the scale of each strategy and choose combinations of strategies that can achieve the reduction targets. It's a dynamic tool and enables users to look at any number of different scenarios. For example, you can look at electrifications of homes in Portland, and you can scale that from 0% electrified to 100% electrified to see that impact of that change. Next slide. I want to take a quick minute just to talk about our local carbon emissions as of 2020, an odd year, but that's the most recent inventory we have. Here you can see that our largest source of emissions currently is electricity at 25%, followed very closely by gasoline, then natural gas at 22%, and diesel is our 4th largest source at 17%. The pathways analysis and the climate emergency work plan focus on reductions from these sources, along with other fossil fuels. Next slide. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide, really explaining this graphic for folks that we published in the plan. The pathways analysis is an analytical foundation for the priorities presented in the work plan. The climate emergency work plan presented just one possible scenario. So what you see here is one scenario. It's the middle of the road scenario, which is actually still pretty aggressive, achieving a 60% reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. But it is not the most aggressive scenario. First, I want to note the dotted area at the top. which represents our business as usual. And it's really a departure from how we've presented this kind of business as usual in the past. This is the sort of a stack up of all the state and federal policies that have already been adopted. As you can see, it doesn't get us to 50% below, which is here in the center, or net zero in 2050. So clearly there's more work that we need to accelerate at the local level to hit those adopted targets. But it is impressive to see the impact of work that's already happening. Second, the gray area here in the middle shows the impact of all of the reduction strategies modeled in the Pathways tool. This represents the sum benefit of activities across sectors. The third, the colored wedges, represent the remaining emissions that would still be produced between now and 2050 by sector, reaching net zero in 2050. And we have a few key takeaways I want to share, really kind of two main ones. So first, this analysis showed us that it is possible to achieve our adopted targets with the tools and strategies that we have available to us today. This is great news. But it also showed us that there's no single silver bullet, no single strategy that gets us to net zero. Most reduction strategies we looked at have less than a 5% reduction in emissions. What gets us there is the cumulative and interactive effect among all of the known strategies together. I'm going to quickly run through some of the strategies considered in the Pathways tool just to give you a quick sense of what's included. We have energy efficiency for existing buildings, advanced building energy codes for new construction, renewable electricity and the grid, renewable natural gas, electrification of existing buildings, industrial innovation, which is a bit nebulous, but you'll hear more about that tonight probably, and a set of preferred strategies from the Portland Bureau of Transportation. This is a bundle of preferred policies that the Transportation Bureau has put together, and includes, first of all, road and parking pricing strategies, reduction in fuel carbon intensity from the State Clean Fuels Program, transportation demand management and operational improvements, and strategic electrification, which includes providing e-bike purchase incentives, increasing the percentage of passenger and goods delivered by electric vehicles, and increasing electric vehicle chargers and heavy truck electrification. Then we have the low carbon biofuels, renewable fuels that can replace some fossil diesel use here in the city by 2030, with full electrification of the vehicle fleet by 2050. And lastly, we're getting to net zero because of extensive forest carbon storage that sequesters the remaining carbon emissions from hard to abate sources, like fugitive emissions from landfills and wastewater treatment plants, and any of the other remaining fossil fuels. A reminder that this is just one scenario that achieves the targets. Pathways does not just prescribe how these reductions are achieved, and that will be determined through various public processes over the coming years. Next slide. The Climate Emergency Work Plan includes priority actions for council and our community to consider over the next 3 years. Because these put us on a path towards achieving our carbon reduction goals, the pathway analysis helped to show the most critical priorities, including 100% renewable electricity, which achieved a 12% reduction in overall emissions. And that's by getting to 100% renewable by 2040 with an 80% renewable by 2030, sorry. And this is really our highest priority action because so many other actions depend on a renewable electricity grid. Transportation Bureau's preferred policy scenario also achieved a 9% reduction, and full passenger electric vehicle electrification, also a 9% reduction. Renewable biofuels, replacing diesel fuel by 2030 was a 7% reduction. And looking at our industrial innovation through the Clean Industry Hub and other actions that will help to remove industrial emissions, like the state climate protection program, will achieve a 6% reduction. So you can see why we chose to prioritize these activities in the climate work plan over the next 3 years to really help get us moving. Further explanation of the Pathways tool is on our website, including a link to the tool. We'll be sure to put that link in the chat if someone hasn't already done that. And we're happy to do deeper dives into this analysis, but we just don't have time to do that tonight. And so now I'm going to hand it off to Harmony to facilitate our Q&A.
Thank you, Kyle. So as just mentioned, we are opening this up for questions before we jump into the individual topics. We did have one in the chat from Terry. Is it correct reading of this chart that there's essentially no mandated reductions in buildings and industry sectors until 2030? And then Andrea's answer to that is that that's being covered by the state, but we have more information in the climate and health standards, which is one of the topics that is part of the poll.
I just want to clarify that I was only responding to the building side of that question, and I didn't see the industry part of that question. So we can kick that to our industry folks if we want to answer that right now. I'm not sure. We don't have any industrial mandates at the city level. Sonrisa or Janet, you want to speak to that?
Yeah. This is another thing. If you vote for the clean industry topic, you'll hear more about this, but we don't have a mandate at the city level right now for industry, and that a lot of that is because of the technology to decarbonize industry is developing kind of in real time. So we're trying to figure out what that would be. And that's why there's a 2030 date in there and not a 2022 date.
Thank you, Sonrisa. Any other questions? Again, if you would like to ask Real Voice, if you hit the little reactions at the bottom, there's a raise hand function and you can raise your hand and we can have you unmute and ask your question, or you can drop it in the chat. Okay, well, I guess we can keep on moving forward to the big finale here. So as mentioned before, we are going to do a poll on which 3 topics we're going to have presentations on today. So that's going to pop up for you here on your screen. These are our 6 options. We ask you to select 3 of them in the poll. So transportation electrification, climate and health standards, clean industry hub, home energy score, clean electricity for all, and embodied carbon and deconstruction. So you can just pick any 3 that you want to hear about, and then we'll get the results and let you know what our 3 topics are for this evening.
We're going to leave this up for a minute, right? Because there's a lot of information on that slide.
Yes, absolutely. We'll give it here just a minute, and then we'll see where we land.
This is fun. I'm watching it happen in real time.
And again, you get 3 choices. So make sure you choose your top 3, not just your one. 3 choices each.
While we're voting, I want to note that we know that the pathways analysis is dense and deep and hard to get in 7 minutes. And that's why we did post a fuller report about what that tool is and how it works on our website. And as Kyle mentioned, if you work for an organization where you really need to dive deeper, or otherwise, we are available to present and peek under the hood of what that tool is. It is not the end all be all. It's not perfect, but it is definitely been very helpful in helping us develop our strategy going forward. It looks like things are still moving, Harmony. How do I know when it's over?
Let's just give it 10 more seconds. Get your vote in if you haven't yet, and then we'll go ahead and call it.
Looks like we have 89% participation in from our attendance.
That sounds about right. Yeah, because anyone who's on staff didn't get to vote. So we should be good. We're skewing the numbers.
Okay. Are you going to officially end the poll? Because I can't, it's not like, yeah. Well, it looks like we have clean electricity for all, climate and health standards, and clean industry hub. So I'll say that again. clean electricity for all, climate and health standards, and clean industry hub. So let's start with clean electricity for all. So it's going to take us 1 second to just tee up the presentation.
Awesome. And I'll just jump in and make sure everyone can hear me because I'll be giving our first presentation here. Awesome. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So good evening. And once again, thank you all for joining our climate conversation. Again, my name is Paul Hawkins. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Buildings and Energy Program Manager for our climate team at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Thank you for giving clean energy your vote. I'm excited to talk to you all for about the next 10 minutes or so. Plan to share an exciting new opportunity to make clean electricity the default for all Portlanders. So we can jump to the next slide. As you've heard from the city's climate emergency work plan, Portland can and must accelerate the clean energy transition. Action E1 of the work plan outlines the importance of decarbonizing our electric grid that delivers the electricity for things like our home heating or electric transportation. The electricity that we use is a huge contributor to the city's total source-based emissions. Electricity produced from burning fossil fuels like coal or natural gas makes up approximately 25% of the city's total emissions. So you heard a little bit of this and saw this image from Kyle's Pathways presentation earlier. The city has prioritized reducing the emissions from our electricity by establishing a few key goals. These goals include 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And one that I particularly like is a goal of 2% community ownership of renewable energy generation assets by 2030 and 10% ownership by 2050. So this last goal is really an important step towards energy justice. And if this is a new term for you, energy justice refers to the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in our energy system, in our electricity grid. It seeks to remediate social, economic, and health burdens on those disproportionately harmed by the energy system. Overall, energy justice, really explicitly centers the concerns of frontline Indigenous communities and historically underrepresented communities. Energy justice aims to make energy accessible, affordable, and clean for all communities. So with that said, we have a lot of work to do together with community to better define what this goal of community ownership means and what it really looks like for Portlanders. So we can move to the next slide here. So fortunately, the city of Portland is not alone in the clean energy transition. The state of Oregon celebrated historic energy legislation in 2021 that commits our state to 100% emissions-free electricity by 2040. This includes mandated timelines for Portland General Electric and for Pacific Power. The legislation will directly reduce the emissions that come from electricity generation. For reference, according to the Oregon Department of Energy, in 2020, nearly 50% of the state's electricity came from coal or natural gas. So this legislation, House Bill 2021, includes a really important provision that I'd like to share with you all today. I'll refer to it as 100% clean electricity for all. But for those of you who like to do your homework and want to do a little bit more research, you can find the full text of this under Section 20 of House Bill 2021. So this provision provides a pathway for local governments and communities to really accelerate the adoption of 100% clean electricity for all. So we'll jump to the next slide here. So today, Portlanders are actually very familiar with renewable electricity programs. And in fact, Portland ranks #1 nationwide in voluntary opt-in programs. You may know these programs from PGE is Green Future Choice, and Pacific Power's program is Blue Sky. They both boast some of the nation's highest participation rates at 26% and 10% respectively. So if you're one of those folks that has already enrolled, just want to take a moment and thank you for choosing renewable power. The difference here, what 100% clean electricity for all really hopes to accomplish is to design an opt-out program that makes clean power the default for all Portlanders. This will increase access to emissions-free power that really benefits our community directly. That means that each time you turn on the light or each time you charge your cell phone, you'll know that the electricity is emissions-free. So the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability is planning a robust community engagement process for 2023 to seek input on how to design this program, this opt-out program. And we want to really get input from the community on what the costs and benefits that this program can provide to Portlanders. So we'd like to better understand, for example, the community's desire and ability to contribute financially to this clean energy transition. We understand that it's important to be transparent about costs and to be upfront about those costs. So I'll share with you an estimate today. The best estimate we have today for this program of 100% clean electricity for all could ask residents to pay an additional 5 or 10% for their electricity costs. Now, depending on your bill, this could be around $100 a year or less than $10 per month. It's about the same as your Netflix subscription. So just imagine you could be binge watching your favorite television show with the comfort that your TV habits are emissions free. Jokes aside, we recognize that this cost may be burdensome to folks experiencing low income, and I'm happy to say that early program design already includes subsidies so that this program would be at no cost to low income homeowners. So overall, we really envision a community process that co-develops this and seeks to define how the community will benefit from clean energy beyond just the basic electrons and emissions reductions. We hope to work with frontline communities to define what community ownership looks like and what community-based energy generation should be, who should have ownership and access to it. So we'll be working on this throughout 2023 and probably into 2024. And we look forward to gathering input from you all. Please do consider joining our future climate conversations. Please do keep an eye out via the BPS newsletter for more ways to participate. But with that, I think I'll go to the next slide and open it up for a few questions before we pass off to our next presenter.
Thank you, Paul. Again, feel free to drop any questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have any questions on what was just presented. Give it just a second in case anybody's typing before we move on to our next topic.
Yeah, and I'll offer one just quick one-sentence synopsis of really moving some of the voluntary programs that we have today from opt-in and individual action to an opt-out style that's really collective action that benefits and provides access to more individuals.
Thank you, Brian. I see you.
Thanks, Harmony. How many of these actions, let's say this one, would be based on voter input versus actions that the city council mandates?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We are certainly trying to strike a balance and co-create what this looks like. We'd like to deliver benefit to community. If community is going to pay for this, what do they get in return? But at the same time, recognizing the priority action here, E1 in our climate emergency work plan, and that this is one of the main levers when you talk about electrifying buildings and transportation. Those don't really cut emissions if your electricity supply is still based off of fossil fuels. So there is a fine balance there, and that really is what we're looking to gather input on from community.
And To answer just maybe a little bit further, I think most of the things that are in the climate emergency work plan are not voter issues. They're a city council consideration. That was sort of the intent. There would be a city council action eventually, and also a public utility commission process to move this clean electricity work forward. So opportunities for public input in multiple venues.
Good, thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat here. Is opt-out and opt-in pricing the same?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think the estimates today on PGE and Pacific Power's websites show about $7 a month. So we're talking at a very comparable price point for this opt-in participation and this opt-out participation. It's just the collective action that overall can make renewable electricity less expensive. So I'm sort of pairing a second question here that I see in the chat as well. At what point will renewable electricity be as expensive or less expensive than non-renewable? And I think that's a really good question. The estimates I shared now are really just early estimates, and we don't know yet. But I think the collective action and collective subscription to renewable electricity or clean electricity is going to bring the price down. And so you'll see that change over time, but I don't have more detail to share tonight.
And I'd also like to invite anyone else on the call who knows something about this space and works in this space. Like we're trying to create a conversation. So if, we're not electricity supply forecast experts, but we do work with utilities to try to understand the pricing implications. And we would really I'd welcome anyone else from my team or anyone else in the audience tonight to weigh in on what you might know and bring to this conversation.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions coming in through the chat here. Can a carbon surcharge make up the difference, realizing that this is a utility commission issue?
Probably. I mean, economically, carbon surcharges make a lot of sense. Politically, they don't go anywhere. So I don't know. Certainly, we need to figure out vehicles to raise revenue to do this work. And I think that's in the mix.
Okay, and it looks like one more in the chat here of great idea, opt out with subsidy buy-in. Is this the #1 action regarding electricity emissions reduction? And can you briefly tell us #2 or whatever is at the top?
What is #2?
Yeah. So this is E1 in the climate emergency work plan. So priority #1 under E for electricity, and E2 is actually investing in community-owned renewable energy generation. So I did sort of mention that, really bringing the power to the people, to use that catchphrase.
All right, so we're gonna move on to our next topic. So we're gonna get that PowerPoint queued up here, and that is gonna be the Clean Industry Hub.
Thank you, Sean, for being your tech person. So yeah, we can get started. I'll just reintroduce myself quickly. I'm Sonrisa Cooper, Sustainable Economy and Just Transition Analyst. And my work is really all about making sure that our climate action creates economic benefits for communities that are at the front lines of climate change. And I'm here with my colleague, Janet Hammer. You want to introduce yourself quickly?
Hey everyone, I am still Janet Hammer, she, her pronouns, leading the Clean Industry Assessment Roadmap, which we'll fill you in on here in just a bit.
Great. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking, kind of giving a high-level overview of our industrial decarbonization work and talk about why it matters and what we are doing about it. Next slide, please. So just to give a little context at the beginning about why we're talking about industry. So industry produces about 13% of Portland's sector-based greenhouse gas emissions, which is why it's one of the priority areas in the climate emergency work plan. If you're following along with the plan itself, it's section I1. It's actually the only I, there's just one thing in there right now. And so when we say the word industry, what we really mean by that is primarily businesses that do manufacturing, and also some other energy intensive activities such as power plants located at universities and hospitals. But we're mostly talking about manufacturing here. Industry plays a really important role in Portland's economy. For example, the industrial sector provides about 22% of jobs in Portland. So more than 1 in 5 people are working in the industrial sector. And there's a lot of economic opportunity in this area. It's a really important source of middle wage, family wage jobs for people that don't have a bachelor's degree. So there's a lot of upward mobility in this sector. And the higher wages in industry help reduce income disparities for workers of color. So this is a really vital part of our economy. And our approach to industrial decarbonization is grounded in the concept of a just transition. So if you're not familiar with that phrase, a just transition is the idea that a healthy economy and a clean environment can coexist. And as we transition from an extraction-based economy to a green economy, we need to center the people who are most impacted by climate change, which is mostly people of color and low-income people. Industry can really play multiple roles in the energy transition as well, which is why it's so important. We can cut carbon emissions in the sector by shifting away from fossil fuels, and industry can also manufacture new products that will enable the energy transition for other sectors. So it can manufacture things like wind power, solar panels, and other things that will advance decarbonization in other areas. This is why it's really vital for us to focus on decarbonizing industry, because it has benefits for the environment, it has benefits for the economy, and it has benefits for the community as a whole. Next slide. I'm going to pass it back to Janet for this part.
All right. Well, as was noted a little earlier, the clean industry work is work that's new to the city, which is something that's pretty typical across US cities. So once again, Portland is out ahead as a leader and innovator in this space. Part of the reason you didn't see a goal there before 2030 was because it's just such a new area that like setting a goal without being grounded in information wouldn't really make too much sense. And also, as Sonrisa noted, there are a few unique challenges to industrial decarbonization that we need to really grapple with as we try to figure out what are the pathways forward. So one of those is that emissions in this sector are hard to reduce for many producers because they require high temperature processes that can't, there isn't an easy switch to electrification for, or they might require inputs that have a large carbon footprint, or they need custom or specialized equipment. Sometimes it doesn't exist yet. So for some businesses, the technology needed to decarbonize just simply doesn't exist. In other cases, the challenge for businesses is the technology exists, but they just don't have the knowledge or the resources to make those changes. So uptake can be kind of challenging for those businesses within the sector. Next slide. So in the city of Portland, our current clean industry efforts came from conversations with the city and industrial businesses. And what was heard loud and clear from businesses was a recognition that they need to accelerate their transition to clean energy and an ask for support in doing that. But there's not a blueprint for doing so that exists yet. So we're being really intentional about working across stakeholder groups to build a shared understanding of the situation, like where are we at, what are the opportunities, and the best solutions for our context. So we've got kind of these two pieces right now we're working on with an industry assessment and roadmap. So the assessment is going to give us a sense of the existing conditions around carbon, waste, emissions, and equity and inclusion. We're also going to be looking around the globe at lessons learned from other clean industry models and figure out what might translate and be a good fit for our region. And we'll also be exploring policy and finance tools that might be available to help the industrial sector make the transition and meet those emission reduction goals. The roadmap process will engage our diverse stakeholders in reviewing those assessment findings and opportunities and determining priorities and next steps for moving forward. We're anticipating that we'll be completing the assessment and the roadmap process June of 2023. So stay tuned there. So Risa?
Thanks. Next slide. Yeah, so to start wrapping us up a little bit, I just wanted to mention that this work is not happening in a vacuum. Our industrial decarb work is complemented by federal initiatives that support clean industry, such as the Industrial Decarbonization Roadmap that the U.S. Department of Energy put out, and funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law that support innovation in the industrial sector. I also wanted to mention that this summer we had the privilege to participate in a learning exchange with the Danish government, which was really exciting. That's what this photo is from, by the way. So a group of Portland leaders got to travel to Denmark to learn about their industrial decarbonization efforts, which are very advanced. And then in October, our group in Portland reunited to host a group of Danes here who traveled to Portland to learn about what we're doing and to share lessons that they had about clean industry. So one of the main takeaways that we got from that Danish experience was really about how essential collaboration was to their process. So success in our clean industry work is going to depend on having industry, government, climate justice, labor, academia, kind of everyone at the table, and all stakeholders working together towards a shared climate goal. And this really isn't something that can be done alone. We recognize that industry is a really technical field, but the work in a lot of ways is very relationship based. So we are really trying to invest in building and strengthening those relationships so that we can work together towards solutions for industry, and we can achieve our climate goals and also support the just transition in that work. Next slide. Yeah, okay, this is just the closing slide. I hope that this was informative. This is one of our newest areas of climate action, so I'm really glad that we got to share it with people today, because we haven't really had a chance to do that yet. And as Janet mentioned earlier, the clean industry assessment is just getting underway, and we anticipate that the findings and recommendations will be ready in the summer. So just stay tuned, and I'll stop there and open it up for any questions.
We can do in the chat, or again, if you want to raise your hand, then we can do it vocally as well. Give it just a second in case anyone is typing.
I'll just make the pitch that when any of your friends or family or colleagues say, hey, there's some sort of a survey about clean industry that someone asked me to fill it out, make sure you say, oh yeah, that's fantastic. You should definitely fill out that survey, because we'll help us get good data so we can make good decisions.
And I'll just invite anyone who voted for this topic to chime in and like what motivated you to vote for it. What were you hoping to hear? Zoom is hard.
I guess while we're waiting, I guess I just want to underscore that this really is very new. I'm not sure how much that came across. Like, there are not really any other American cities that are doing this, and most of the innovation in industry is coming out of Europe. And so we're kind of at the vanguard of cities that are working on this, which is really exciting.
We have Terry in the chat here of asking, you want to preview a finding or recommendation that's already surfacing?
Well, we have a vote coming up at City Council tomorrow that I'll mention, but I don't want to take away from what people voted on. There is an agenda at City Council, agenda item at City Council, a continuation of our first reading on a renewable fuel standard. And this would replace petroleum diesel at the pump by 2030. We didn't really want to talk about it tonight because I don't know how it's going to turn out. And so once we get through tomorrow and find out a little bit more, then I think we would talk about it in one of our future presentations. But yeah, we really are wanting to show work that is like still gathering steam, that there's opportunity to participate and inform and guide. It wasn't our intent to come tonight to show a bunch of things that have already taken place. So this is a little bit about what is happening over the next 3 years. All right, so with that, I guess maybe we'll pivot to the third presentation.
Yeah, so our final presentation of the evening is going to be the climate and health standards. We'll pass it off to our team.
All right, thank you, Harmony. My name is Vin Mason again. I'm a climate policy advisor at the city. I'll be covering the topic of climate and health standards, action item B1 in the climate emergency work plan. Next slide, please. All right, so the climate and health standards are a policy proposal to decarbonize Portland's existing commercial and multifamily residential buildings that are larger than 20,000 square feet, including condominiums and rental apartments. For reference, a 25-unit apartment building is roughly 20,000 square feet. The heating and powering of these buildings in Portland accounts for about 20% of our citywide carbon emissions. Next slide. Climate and health standards are one of the tools that local governments have to decarbonize buildings. Cities like Boston, Denver, New York, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and the whole state of Washington already adopted this type of policy. And last year, the city of Portland joined these cities and many others in the National Building Performance Standards Coalition. Next slide. To meet Portland's long-term climate goals, we are proposing a carbon performance standard. This graph illustrates how the standard could work. The left axis of the graph is showing the carbon footprint of 3 different buildings in 2023. Every 4 years, the owner of each building would be required to reduce its carbon emissions by 15% until reaching 0 in 2050. A performance standard gives the building owner flexibility to choose how they will reduce emissions. For instance, an owner could select renewable electricity from the utility and make an energy efficiency improvements, like replacing light bulbs with LEDs or installing heat pump water heaters. Next slide. Equity and anti-racism are core values of the city of Portland. In developing the climate and health standards, we wanted to ensure that the policy would reduce carbon emissions while also advancing racial equity. The city followed a community-led engagement model created with community partners and Built Shift to elevate the voices and decision-making power of people of color, knowing that those who are least responsible for climate change are also most affected by its impacts. Next slide. So Built Shift, Building Community, Shifting Power, is a collective of Black and Brown community members and representatives from community-based organizations in Portland. Over the last several years, they hosted a community forum, an energy burden workshop, and policy convenings. These events explored the intersection of building decarbonization and racial equity. The result of Built Shift's community-led engagement is a policy proposal for rental housing that goes beyond decarbonization. Next slide. The proposed hard standards for rental housing focuses on health, equitable energy, anti-displacement, resilience, and temperature, together referred to as the hard standards. I'll cover examples of each of these intersecting components on the next slide. Next slide. Building decarbonization can reduce health risks, like exposure to air pollutants that cause asthma when natural gas is burned in stoves. Equitable energy considers how lowering carbon emissions can reduce energy bills and promote community-owned renewable energy, like we saw in referenced in E2 in the Climate Emergency Work Plan. Anti-displacement prevents the cost of building improvements from being passed through as higher rent. Resilience prepares people for power outages during extreme climate events, and a temperature standard would give renters access to cooling during heat waves. By including these hard standards for apartments with the overall carbon performance standards, the city developed a policy concept in March of this year. Since then, we have been meeting with stakeholders to receive feedback. To learn more, you can download the policy concept from the Climate and Health Standards webpage, where you can sign up. You can also go there to sign up for email updates, including future opportunities for public comment. So I think we can drop that in the chat wing, if you don't mind, the link to the Climate Health Standards webpage. And with that, I'm happy to wrap us up here with any additional questions. It's like there might be some in the chat.
I think our chat is being answered in the chat by Sonrisa and Janet, because that was for Clean Industry Hub, but happy to open it up also for questions for the climate and health standards. Haven, in the chat, you talked about rental housing. Can you address condos as well? Like owned multifamily, I think, if I am understanding Julie correctly.
Yeah, great question. And so for multifamily residential, we are looking at the hard standards for rental housing to really protect renter interests. But then the carbon standards to get to our goals of net zero by 2050, we would want to apply those to condominiums as well. So we are looking at the condominium buildings that are 20,000 square feet and larger.
Okay, and also in the chat, some feedback. Those heart standards look amazing. No worries, Bernadette. Will this require city legislation, or is this something that you're looking to implement?
Yeah, great question. So they don't exist yet. If they are a proposal, and that's the document that's downloadable on the webpage, is to see the proposal. And that's something we're refining. To actually bring those standards into place and establish them, we would need a city council decision by ordinance.
And also in the chat, do you need state legislation for any of the building standards?
Currently, we understand we don't need state legislation for them. In other cities, there are energy performance standards like Denver and Washington, D.C. And that's not an option for us because the state preempts the city of Portland from having its own energy code for new construction, which essentially applies to existing buildings. As soon as you take out a permit to update an existing building, the new construction code becomes effective. But by having options with the carbon standards, we wouldn't be specifying energy only. There would be an option to look at renewable energy or energy efficiency. So that is one way we understand the preemption of the state doesn't affect the city of Portland.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to pass it off to Julie. Julie has a question.
Kind of a follow-up to the typed question. With the owner occupied, both as someone who's part of an HOA and someone who also has to deal with this for my professional life, just kind of wondering, a lot of buildings that I know of have already started the work to reduce their carbon emissions. And would there be guidance to help people who've already done the LEDs, who've already opted into the renewable energy and done a lot of those pieces before any of this ever takes place? Because you're talking all the easy things are picked off. And so all of a sudden you're stuck doing a much bigger chunk at the beginning, a much more expensive chunk, I would say, at the beginning, if you've already kind of been preemptive at this.
Yeah, right. So some buildings are ahead on the curve, and then they would also have to reduce their emissions 15% every 4 years, which could be more challenging. But remember, they could also select renewable electricity as one of the compliance methods. And as Paul noted, our grid is getting greener over time. We are looking at some options in near term by 2030 in Portland to do that. So that's one pathway. And then for energy efficiency improvements, there can be also electrification as an option for even very efficient new construction that is served by natural gas for its heating could electrify in the future to comply with the standards, or to there's renewable natural gas options in the future. So there are many options. And one of the ideas of the performance standard is really to leave the flexibility up to the building owner. to help. Maybe there's too many options really and too many decisions to make. So to your point, there is assistance that we would like to provide. And the model we follow is called a resource hub, and they have them in the other 6 cities that I mentioned that do have these performance standards. And a resource hub is a third party that's independent from contractors and the city. There's really an advocate, a coach, you could say, for the building owner, or in your case, like for the HOA, to make the best decisions for that building to continue reducing carbon emissions to get to zero and find the best pathways.
I think you're going to run into a little bit of a problem when you have like 86 unit owners who all have to do it, and not all, so you run into those problems where some will and some won't. And so it can mess the whole building up. So it's just something to think about.
Yeah.
As you're putting these policies into place, because you don't always have one owner for a building.
That's a really good point for condominiums. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie and Vin. We have another question here in the comments about like radiant heating and how the hot water efficiency works with that. So with buildings that already exist with radiant floor heating, what is possible with using electricity to heat that flooring?
Oh, great. Very specific question. So there are some options out there like ground source heat pumps. So a heat pump can be used. You could also use an air source heat pump to heat water that's radiant floor heating. Those are retrofits that are possible. But there are also other options like to install instead a ductless heat pump, for instance, that also provides cooling that can meet a temperature standard. So these standards we're looking at, again, are out to 2050. So there's some planning that would happen ahead of time to reach for them. One thing I will point out, though, is, again, the threshold we're looking at for the carbon piece is 20,000 square feet and larger. So radiant floor heating might be something we find more typically in smaller buildings.
Okay,
Not that people with radiant floor heating shouldn't be looking at options to reduce emissions as well.
Okay, kind of final call for questions for our climate and health standards before I pass it back to Andrea. Okay, how are public meetings, buildings, city government buildings being looped into this work?
Paul, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that the city has a green building policy. It was last updated in 2015, so that is something that we're looking at revisiting. It governs basically the city-owned and operated buildings and the energy use therein. It's based largely off of green building standards or LEED building standards. But I think maybe of note for you, Corbin, is regional government Metro recently updated their green building policy and actually expanded it to not just focus on buildings, but green spaces and locations that Metro owns. So I think if you want to look a little bit into the future, Metro's policy is probably a little bit more newer and maybe signal to where we might head as the city.
Thank you, Paul. And then we have another question here in the chat. Are there no proposed requirements for single family dwellings?
I'll take that one. Sorry, just lost my mute. Not at this time. The climate emergency work plan is a 3-year, just to keep in mind, like this is only the next 3 years, and it is by definition a little bit of a prioritization. And we are not focusing on single family residential, except through the Portland Clean Energy Fund. I should note that they have investment dollars out on the street for decarbonization, electrification, energy efficiency, clean energy, things like that, that all are in service to these goals. But from a policy perspective, we would want to get to single family residential. We know it's a substantial part of the carbon picture. And as Kyle pointed out in pathways, that we don't get a pass on any of these actions. We have to do them all. So just because something's not in this climate emergency work plan right now doesn't mean it won't be in the next iteration of. So we're going to be starting public processes for gaining input into the what comes after the 2025. And we'll probably start that in, I don't know, 2024, not sure. But we were focusing on moving some of these pieces forward over these next 3 years. And they're substantial. As you can see, there's a lot to each one of these. Is a whole process with constituencies and stakeholders and equity considerations unto themselves. And that's why we didn't focus too much on the doing of this climate emergency work plan, but all the work is embedded in each of these items that are in it. They're really layered. And I want to note that we will get to some of the things like embodied carbon in future workshop and future conversations that like we didn't get to tonight. So let's see, any thoughts to require? Yeah, lots of thoughts. No.
Okay, we'll do a quick final call for questions, whether it's on these 3 topics or with the brief that we had at the beginning from Andrea and Kyle before we wrap up for the evening. Is there information on the other topics that weren't selected that we can research?
I'd say on our websites.
In the chat here in a second, some links to climate programs and projects, and I'll have a slide up here in a second.
And then just because we're doing well on time, I guess I'll add in that that part of dealing with single family residential emissions has something to do with land use patterns, right? And how we do a dense and transit oriented design and through centers and corridors where we center growth in a certain area and then have good connectivity between and reducing emissions just through how we use land is part of our single family residential strategy. I was thinking a little narrowly when I answered that question, but that's definitely part of it.
Also in the chat, will the presentation decks be available to attendees on the website? And maybe the recording too. I'll add that into the question.
And because we can't think of everything on the spot, I'm getting really good feedback. Dirk, do you want to, so one of the topics that didn't get voted for was home energy score. And that is our it's not a new policy, it's an ongoing program. So I wasn't thinking about it, but I should have been because it was on our list. We do want to talk about it. So Dirk, do you want to say a few words about how home energy score fits into our residential sector strategy? My bad.
Sure. Do you want me to go through my presentation or just?
No, just like a quick, like sort of just that it's a signal for energy efficiency in the market.
Sure. Yeah, I just happened to put a link in the chat to the home energy score program as well. And yeah, home energy score is available at time of listing for buyers in the Portland market. It's required at time of listing, display anywhere where somebody wants to list a home. And it's how we measure things to make a difference. It's the miles per gallon for a home. I went to imagine you went to a car dealership and asked them for the miles per gallon, and the salesperson had no idea what it was, and it wasn't even available. Like, it's kind of silly that we live in homes where that information's not available. So yeah, more on that next time. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Dirk. And then Sean put some information about deconstruction. Sean, do you want to take a minute? Because we do have time.
Sure. So Portland, back in 2015, embarked on a deconstruction policy effort, and we convened an advisory group ranging from a number of different stakeholders, and came to City Council with a recommendation to take a phased approach to deconstruction. So deconstruction, for those that aren't familiar, it's essentially taking a building apart by hand. So instead of mechanically demolishing, it's disassembled by hand with the primary purpose of salvaging building materials for reuse. And our recommendation for a phased approach started with a deconstruction grant program, followed by requirements that could be raised over time as the deconstruction and salvage industry expanded. So in 2015, we launched a grant program for deconstruction projects, and in 2016, we implemented the nation's first deconstruction ordinance, which applies to single dwelling houses and duplexes. So any of those that come in for a demolition permit, they are subject to the deconstruction ordinance if they were built in 1916 or earlier, or historic, regardless of age. So they have to fully deconstruct using a certified deconstruction contractor. And then in 2020, we realized the kind of the third phase of that approach and raised the year built to 1940 or earlier. So that 1916 initially captured about a third of all house demos in Portland, and then the 1940 date or earlier captures 2/3. So we've fundamentally changed how houses are demolished in Portland. So they're salvaged and the building materials go on to live another life in other projects in the city.
Thank you, Sean. We have another question in the chat here. Overall, how has council responded to BPS proposals? Do you envision anything changing in that way?
I don't know. It's like, a lot is changing. We're in a moment of change, but we look forward to working with council and bringing them along on all of these different policies.
Okay, we have some gratitude in the chat. Thank you, everybody. We will be following up after this presentation, not immediately after, but soon, with a survey, just so you have, if you have any feedback after you sleep on it for a night of what we can do better or what you wish we had included or things that we did great, your feedback would be much appreciated. We can also include a link to the recording so you have that available. And I know we did a kind of a link dump in the chat there, but we'll send that to you in that email as well. So you have those different avenues to see the work that we're doing in regards to this. Yeah, Andrea, I'm going to pass it to you.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I'm just really grateful for everyone's attention and engagement. And in that survey, we'll be sort of asking about what you think the next one should be. We're thinking of doing them quarterly, but minus the quarter of the summer. So the next one would be, Pam, what are we thinking? March? I can't remember exactly what we thought the next one would be.
Yeah, March or April.
Okay, so you'll just in the meantime keep an eye on our socials, on our website. We are starting to use those channels a lot more and more intentionally. And yeah, and I think we can give you 10 minutes of your evening back, and we'll hang out here for as long as it takes for folks to exit, but we can consider the night concluded. And thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any last minute questions, I guess this is your chance to ask them, and otherwise have a great evening. Andrea, it's up to you. It looks like there's just a couple people left, so we can hang and chill for a little bit and see if anything pops up, or we can remove those, or we can shut it down for everybody. It's your call.
Let's see so it's just BPS staff left. Yeah, I mean, let's close it. Wait, go ahead, Paul. Is it?
I was
No,
gonna say,
I see
couple
there's
external.
not BPS person, but I'm just, like I would love to do an internal team debrief, but I'd like to close the meeting, and so I can send out a new link.
Sounds good. All right. See you all on the other